Welcome to the Raisina Idea Spot 2025. The topic for discussion today is what's next for energy and the Green Deal. And joining me, I have two very distinguished experts on the topic. Mr. Jayant Sinha, who's a former Minister of State for Civil Aviation from India, and Mr. Alok Sharma, who's a former President COP26, as well as a Climate and Finance Fellow with the Rockefeller Foundation, a member of the House of the Lords, as well as a former Cabinet Minister for Energy and Business with the UK government. So welcome, gentlemen. We have 20 minutes, so we're going to get right at it. So we're at a time today geopolitically where we're at a whirlwind, right? There's a rise of industrial policies. There is weaponization of critical mineral resources, complete monopolization of supply chains, tech to tariff wars, economic protectionism, which have manifested in ways from CBAM to the IRA. So there is a lot happening in this space. And I think one thing that has come to question is what is really the future of the Green Deal? Is it feasible? Is it still practical? Now that energy security is a concern for not just the global south, but also the global north, as we have seen and witnessed more recently, is there a sense of energy pragmatism that has come to the fore which calls for a more balanced energy mix, which includes not just renewables, but also nuclear, also hydro, also, fossils to a certain degree. So, I'd love to get your thoughts on that. So, Mr. Sinha, would you like to start?
Sure. So, Mannat, there's a lot of chatter right now about the fact that the Green New Deal is off because of the changes in the United States. As far as India is concerned, profits trump politics. Profits trump politics. And for us, the green transformation is a matter of pure economics and pure survival. So independent of what happens geopolitically in terms of whether climate is in or out from a political point of view, the economics for India are such that we have to continue on the green transformation or the Green New Deal, as you called it. It's very straightforward. We are a country with a lot of solar irradiation. So for us, already now and increasingly so in the future, given where the technology curves are, solar, 24/7, round-the-clock solar is going to be cheaper than coal, right? And this is without worrying about, climate change or any of that. Very simply, solar is going to be cheaper. So purely from a profit perspective and from the fact that we import such a huge amount of fossil fuels, over $200 billion a year of fossil fuel imports, we have to move to solar because it's a domestic energy source. It's cheaper and it gives us more energy security. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, if you look at electric mobility, we have 250 million vehicles in India now. 250 million vehicles. We have buses, we have trucks, we have cars, we have two-wheelers, three-wheelers, four-wheelers, all of these. If we switch them to electric, and China has already shown that if you do that at scale, it's actually cheaper and more profitable than having them on fossil fuels. So whether we look at energy or we look at transportation and a whole host of other industries that benefit from these kinds of sustainable energy sources, profits do trump politics. It's in absolutely our interest to continue to pursue the green transformation. We'll have a more efficient, more sustainable, and a more competitive economy if we pursue the green transformation. And so, as I say, for India, certainly for India, the rest of the world obviously has to do their own calculations. But for India, net zero is massively net positive.
Yes, I remember that slogan from our G20 times. But a quick follow-up to that would be, do you believe that a kind of climate denialism like we see in the United States are not going to affect the climate green flows that come into the emerging world? And that will certainly have implications on the energy transition agenda as well. Because even for India, we can't purely rely on domestic resource mobilization. We want foreign capital. We expect private capital. And if the West is sort of grappling with their own priorities and domestic concerns, and like we see the kind of climate denialism,
So Mannat, your question is, can we do the green transformation in India using just commercial capital? And the reason is, you're saying the concessional capital flows, MDB flows will be, of course, impeded by, the changes that are happening geopolitically. I never believed and still do not believe that concessional capital is going to power India's green transformation. It has to be commercial capital. And I come from the investment world myself. It has to be return generating capital that is completely competitive. I'm generating 18, 19% net dollar returns for infrastructure investments in India. If I can deliver that, there's trillions of dollars of capital available. So we have to have the conditions there to make commercial capital flow, and that's what we need to do.
Right. I'm going to follow up to that, on that later, on credit ratings and I think reforms in a bit. But Mr. Sharma, your thoughts. And and for you specifically, I want you to talk about CBAM as well, because do you believe that there will be certain adjustments to the CBAM mechanism given the geopolitical realities, or will it be, will it come out with the same force that it's been intended?
Yeah. Okay, well, let me take the first question you raised about geopolitics impeding action. And there's no doubt that we have geopolitical headwinds. But actually, just over 3 years ago, we did COP26, which you could argue is a sort of global Green Deal. We faced similar headwinds, geopolitical headwinds. We had COVID. We had the balance sheets of companies, but also countries hugely stretched. We managed to get almost 200 countries to agree on a climate deal, the Glasgow Climate Pact, aimed at getting more finance flowing, aimed at cutting emissions, and ultimately keeping temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So we've shown that it can be done. And the reason that countries came together was economic self-interest, collective economic self-interest, exactly as Mr. Sinha has said. And they also understood the cost of inaction. I mean, look at India, for instance. You see the impact of climate in this country as you do everywhere. The Asian Development Bank has suggested that actually, unless you take action on climate, by 2070, it could affect 25% of India's GDP. I mean, there's a real cost to this, but also there is a huge economic upside in terms of jobs, in terms of the economy, in terms of export opportunities. So I agree very much that actually, it is the economy and its economic considerations as well as environmental ones which is going to drive forward us to net zero. You raised the issue about finance, and look, we've got all sorts of climate funds that are out there. You add all of them up, there's significant amounts of money, but actually we need trillions a year to be motivated, and that can only come from the private sector. When I was in government, one of the things that we did was to set up just energy transition partnerships with some developing nations. And this was about working with them to their agenda to have an energy transformation. But that requires regulatory reform, that requires planning reform, that requires grid infrastructure to be updated, and above all, for the private sector to be able to get an economic return. So, in the UK, we've built the second biggest offshore wind sector in the world because we've had a revenue mechanism called contracts for difference auction processes. That's the sort of thing we need to be deploying, is getting that private sector capital in. And finally, your point about CBAMs. So, look, we've certainly in the EU, we've had, and the UK is no longer in the EU, but the EU certainly has pushed forward with a lot of legislation on climate and sustainability. And clearly, you need to be able to measure if you want to show progress. But I think the realization now is that if you want to be competitive, there needs to be simplification, there needs to be consolidation, and that is happening in the EU. And similarly, in terms of CBAMs, look, my view is that CBAMs will come in. But again, there's been an adjustment where the EU has now talked about taking 80% of the companies that were previously going to be covered by CBAMs out, because they've said that 20% of the companies affected basically account for over 95% of the emissions. So there is a lot of sort of pragmatism that's coming into this, but I certainly expect CBAMs will continue, certainly in the UK.
Other countries like the UK is considered one as well,
the
right?
UK under the last government, we were talking about CBAMs policy.
Which makes sense. I think that brings me to the point on private capital, which you both have raised, which is crucial and critical for the transition around the world, not just in the South. I want you to maybe talk a little more about what are the reforms that you think we can bring about, both from an international financial architecture perspective, as well as from domestic perspective. And I think it would be interesting to get perhaps your views on an international architecture and, Mr. Sharma's views from a domestic perspective. And why I say that is because as a recipient capital nation like India, what would you expect the world and the foreign capital to be mindful of when they invest in a country like India? And for you, as coming from the UK, which is a significant capital provider on green investments around the world, particularly in emerging economies, What is your expectation in terms of regulatory reform in recipient countries to be able to really move the needle and do beyond what's already been done?
No, those are great questions, Mannat, and it's wonderful that we have Lord Sharma here as well, because he obviously represents a great global financial hub, which is London and the UK, which has pioneered so many important financial instruments. And of course, I represent India's requirements, which if we have to do this right, the green transformation in India, we need to deploy $50 to $100 billion a year, every single year, of private commercial capital into green investments in India. So that's the scale we are talking about, $1 trillion over the next 10 or 15 years. And exactly as Lord Sharma said, it has to be commercial capital flowing in from the global north, from London, from New York, from Singapore, from Dubai into India. That's the only way we can do it.
Diversify the portfolio.
No, it has to be, because there are plentiful sources of capital in all these different global financial hubs, and they have to come to a country like India because our needs are so vast. We already have a $4 trillion economy going to 10, 15, 20 trillion. We need trillions of dollars of green investments. We can mobilize some of it domestically, but a lot of it has to come from outside of India. Now, what are the conditions under which these global capital flows will happen? So there are three very important conditions. Number one, we've got to get our policy environment right. And here the good news is I was in fact with the Honorable Finance Minister last night at dinner, and she talked about all the policy heavy lifting that has already happened in India. And a lot continues to happen, whether it's, as I said, in transportation, in energy, in basic materials. In all of these areas, important steps have been taken and continue to be taken. So that's one. Number two, we need the support of the MDBs. And here I'd ask my friend, Lord Sharma, to help us here, and the UK has a very important role to play, because unless the MDBs and the development finance architecture of this world helps us for things like long-term currency hedging, for blended finance instruments of various kinds, unless we can get that little bit of a nudge, little bit of a boost, we are not going to be able to get the commercial capital to come. And there are some systemic issues that companies can't deal with. So Tata Steel, when it raises money in the UK, it's raising at one cost of capital. When it's raising for exactly the same thing in India, it's raising at another cost of capital, because now you're carrying sovereign risk in India that you don't carry in the UK. So we need help from the global financial architecture in terms of MDBs. That's
and I want you to touch upon the role
and number
of
three,
credit
let me
ratings
just to conclude. And number three, we need commercial capital to understand that there are climate risks. And in fact, exactly as Lord Sharma also said, ADB's come out and said 25%. We've had, the Global Central Bank Alliance come in and say India's GDP is going to be affected by 20-25% as well. So these numbers are kind of coming in that range. They have risks if they don't invest in climate adaptation and climate mitigation. They need to understand that, and so they have to be open. I'm not saying that as fiduciaries, they should give us lower returns, not at all. But at the same time, they have to be open to that. So one, policy; two, MDBs coming up with these blended finance instruments. And then number three, we have to have commercial capital being open, willing to step in.
But I want you to talk more about the role of credit ratings there, because we have a credit rating system which is quite antiquated. They've been following methodologies which in some sense do add a premium to emerging economies, of course, because of a sovereign risk element, but also they fail to adopt and adapt to climate risk, frameworks, which in their decision-making and investment decision-making analysis. So how do you think we can really reform that kind of framework, and which are the stakeholders who could perhaps help push that agenda? Because it's not a country-led effort. It's a and that's one of the things that was also recommended by Professor Larry Summers and Mr. N.K. Singh in the Triple Agenda report. So what can countries like India do to really push for that? Should we, push for that at platforms like G20?
We are doing all the right things, which is, obviously there's been this very important report from the high level group that's come in to talk about reforms in the MDB architecture. We've talked about a whole range of blended finance instruments that need to be developed. And of course, now it's time for the World Bank, the IFC, all of these development agencies to really step up. We're very fortunate that somebody who both, I'm sure Lord Sharma knows well and I know well, Mark Carney is the Prime Minister of Canada, who completely understands these issues, had a very instrumental role to play in the Glasgow Declaration, is there and can help us shape some of this.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think the one thing, if we could get every corporate, every financial institution to do, is to price climate risk in every single financial decision. If we were able to get there, the money would absolutely flow in the right direction.
Absolutely.
I mean, let's look at the finance flows when it comes to energy. So last year we had about 2 trillion going into clean energy globally, a trillion still unfortunately into fossil fuels. Now that was reversed from 5 years ago. So we are making progress. But again, I mean, look at fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, I think over time we should be looking to transition away from those. If you want to level the playing field, that's what's important in terms of getting capital actually flowing in the right direction. And, when it comes to finance from developed countries to developing nations, I mean, I talked about this sort of 2 trillion. If you take out China, a lot of the money of that 2 trillion has gone to developed countries. And the reason...
It's only 15% that's gone to emerging economies.
Absolutely. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is because I don't think we have enough, what I would call oven-ready or tawa-ready projects, if we can call it that, bankable projects in developing nations. And there needs to be regulatory reform, right? If you want to get the private sector to invest, you need to be sure, or they need to be sure, that they're going to get a return coming back the other way. And so in that sense, some of the work that's going on in terms of regulatory reform is really important. And, I work with the Rockefeller Foundation. There's a lot of work that people like Rockefeller as philanthropies do in terms of providing grants to support governments to look at how they can reform their regulatory architecture. And there's this final point on MDBs. I completely agree with Mr. Sinha, which is that I think, yes, there's a lot the MDBs have been doing in terms of getting more money towards sort of climate action. But actually, we've been talking for a long time about first loss products. We've been talking a long time about products to ensure that sort of currency risk is offset. Those aren't coming forward. And we need to quicken the pace. And one of the things I say to folks in the UK government, for instance, is that it's up to us as shareholders in these institutions to tell them that the remit perhaps has now changed. They were all set up 70 years ago. We weren't talking about climate then. And so I think it's really important that we see further reform in the MDBs and that they are very much part of the solution in getting more public but also private finance flowing.
No, absolutely. And I think there is also a challenge to that because in India today, because of very strong policy signaling, banks don't want to invest in fossils anymore. But at the same time, the scale of clean energy deployment isn't high enough because we don't have that kind of capital. So where does that leave us with the question of energy security? We're not making enough fossil fuel investments. We're not making enough clean energy investments. And how are we going to manage the rising energy demand of the future? So I think those are questions we need to sort of discuss and hopefully deploy solutions
I want to
around.
make the distinction as somebody who has spent a long time as a professional investor, that there's a difference between equity capital and debt capital. Right, so there may be debt capital available, but risk-seeking equity capital is still in short supply in India. So we have a target of 500 gigawatts of renewables, as you know. We need to add 60, 70 gigawatts every single year to get to that 500 gigawatts and not to have the lights go out, frankly, because demand is going so fast in India. Now, to do that, it's not necessarily a question of debt capital. Debt only comes in if you have risk-seeking equity capital coming in. But to have risk-seeking equity capital going in to do utility-scale solar, we have to consistently generate 15% net dollar returns. Right? To generate 15% net dollar returns in IRR terms means that everything has to move in a very streamlined way. Now, part of what we as policymakers and sort of people in the regulatory system have to understand that delays are fatal. Every year that you slip, land acquisition becomes a problem, payments become a problem. Every year that you slip in getting returns, your IRRs go down. Your IRRs go down. Those who are fiduciaries, who are giving capital will say, well, if I can get, 15% investing in an offshore wind project in the UK, why would I give it to people in India? So it's not so much policy that needs to change, but we need a mindset change right down the bureaucratic system so that people recognize that speed is of the essence. Right? And taking away risk is of the essence, because the more regulatory risk that you have, the more policy risk that you have, the higher the returns that investors want. Then it's not 15%, they want 18 or 20% because they're saying, well, wait a second, there's all these other risks that we're dealing with. So we as a system, it's not so much in some ways on policy because the policies are very good. But exactly as, the Honorable Finance Minister said in her budget speech, that we need to deregulate, we have to have a mindset where we can move quickly to be able to tap this capital, because the returns are necessary on the equity side, because the people who are providing the capital, if you're in the capital markets, you're saying, I want this much return, right? So we've got to be able to deliver that return.
Got it. Well, I know we can talk about this for even way longer, but we're going to have to, the session will need to wrap up now. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for coming to Raisina Dialogue, and we'll chat more about this later. But I think my one optimistic note is that the transition agenda is going nowhere. Climate action is still a priority for governments and for the private sector as well, hopefully. So I think we'll end with that.
And just to end on that very positive point, I've not heard a single government here talk about moving away from their climate targets.
Yeah.
And also corporates, really importantly, they are on course.
Yeah.
This thing is happening. The bus has absolutely left
the
station.
And it's an electric bus.
It's an electric bus.
You just better speed up now.
It just needs to speed up.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much.